So welcome to the first lecture, Chapter 1 for the Surf Safe course. We're going to talk about really the basics of food safety today. This chapter just kind of introduces a lot of the things that we're going to go over in more detail in later chapters. But this is just kind of an introduction. Why is this important? What are some of the challenges of food safety, etc. So, we're also going to be looking at how does food become unsafe, what foods are high risk, as well as high-risk populations, etc. So a foodborne illness is a disease that's been transmitted through people through food. So it's technically can be considered an outbreak when the following things have been met. So 2 or more people have the same symptoms after eating the same food. An investigation is conducted by state and local authorities, and the outbreak is confirmed by lab analysis. And sometimes it can be difficult to really determine if something was a foodborne illness or not, especially for an individual. You may get sick, and is it something that you ate? Did you get something from, your kid's daycare? Were you around sick people at work? There's lots of things that can cause similar symptoms. And so that's why we have these investigative arms of our regulatory bodies that can really look and see, is this an outbreak? What may be the cause, etc. So these are all challenges to food safety. If you've worked in a restaurant or a food service operation, you know that it always seems to be time's a limiting factor. You may have different levels of education, different cultures, those kind of things, that high turnover, all of that may make it just more challenging to be 100% food safe. And so that's why we have to be really deliberate about our policies and procedures to ensure food safety. And there are lots of costs of a foodborne illness. So if a restaurant experiences a foodborne illness, a lot of times that may affect their reputation, it may affect their sales, they may look bad in the media, staff may not want to work there, you may have lawsuits, increased insurance premiums, etc. So there are lots of reasons why we want to really make sure that we're being as food safe as possible. And the number one is our customers as well. So what are some reasons why foodborne illness occur? And so we really tend to break our contaminants down into 3 categories. So biological, chemical, and physical contaminants. And our biological contaminants, bacteria, viruses, parasites, fungi, we'll look more detail about these moving forward, but things like E. coli and other things that you've heard about, that all falls under these biological contaminants category. Our chemical contaminants then are things like cleaners, sanitizers, polishers. You look at this you look at this picture, and obviously, we want to avoid spraying our sanitizer anywhere near our food. But these mistakes can be made if people aren't paying attention and things like that. So it's really important to watch out for that. And then physical hazards or physical contaminants are those things that we can normally see a little bit better with our eyes. Band-aids, staples, metal shavings from a can. You open a can and there's some metal shavings off of that. Dirt, glass, it can be natural objects. You could have bones. Now it doesn't mean you serve a chicken wing with bone in, that's a contaminant if they know the bone is there. But let's say you have chicken fingers and there's bone in it and someone just bites into that. That can be a physical contaminant. So we are trying to avoid all of those situations through our food safety practices. So these are the 5 major risk factors that ServSafe identifies for foodborne illness. So purchasing food from unsafe sources, failing to cook food correctly, holding food at incorrect temperatures, and I find this is one people often forget about. They may cook it to the right temperature, but then if it sits out at the wrong temperature, the refrigerator's at the wrong temperature, those things can really be dangerous. Using contaminated equipment, and then practicing poor personal hygiene. And so these risk factors will be talked about in more chapters to come. So again, this just breaks it down a little bit further. The cross-contamination, you can see that with the juice from meat on lettuce. We don't want to do that. Time temperature abuse, poor personal hygiene, poor cleaning, all of those things can matter. So again, when food is stayed too long at temperatures where pathogens grow well, that is considered time temperature abuse. So if it's not been held or stored at the correct temperature, cooked or reheated enough, or cooled correctly. And so we'll talk more about what that looks like in later chapters as well. Again, cross-contamination with pathogens are transferred from one surface to another. And now this picture is a very obvious example of cross-contamination. I like to give another example of how you really have to be careful. Let's say, I've seen this before where you're cutting chicken and you change your cutting board and you change your knife, but I don't know about you, but I'm kind of messy in the kitchen, and so the likelihood that the chicken juice didn't get outside of the cutting board onto the prep table is very slim for me. And so let's say, I changed my cutting board, changed my knife, but I didn't clean my surface, and whether I can see it very well or not, there may be, germs, salmonella, other pathogens from the chicken that made it onto the prep table around that, and then and then I just bring another cutting board and another knife, so I've done that part right, but I didn't wipe off the surface. Now I lay my lettuce on there. You ever cut, some romaine lettuce? It hangs off the cutting board often, and so now I've contaminated it just because I didn't clean my surface, even though I, changed the cutting board and changed the knife. So all of those things are ways that cross-contamination can happen that may not be as obvious as this one in the picture. So again, the same thing can happen if contaminated ingredients are added to food that receives no further cooking, ready-to-eat food. So even things like I touched my cooked chicken with the same tongs I just touched the raw chicken with. So now my cooked chicken, which is ready to eat, is coming into contact with raw, chicken juice from those tongs. Again, fluid strip, it can be even cleaning cloths that are contaminated. So lots of ways that cross-contamination can occur. And then poor personal hygiene is ServSafe's kind of buzzword to look at several of these things. So not washing your hands correctly, working while sick, coughing or sneezing on food, wearing a dirty uniform, all of those things can be examples of how poor personal hygiene can cause foodborne illness. And one note I just want to say is, when studying for ServSafe, it's important to think about the wording that ServSafe uses, because that's often then what you will see on the exam. So poor personal hygiene, for example, that may not be how we normally talk about these things, but that's what ServSafe is going to use to define that. And so pay attention to the words and phrases that ServSafe uses throughout these lectures. That will help you when you're studying to familiarize yourself with some things you may see on the exam. Again, lastly, poor cleaning and sanitation. So if things aren't washed, rinsed, sanitized between uses. Same thing, even with food contact surfaces, sometimes maybe we just wipe it clean, but we really won't wash, rinse, and sanitize it. So really follow the steps to really make sure it's clean and we're reducing pathogens to a safe level. And sanitizing solutions not being at the right level, things like that can definitely affect cleaning and sanitation. So I want to talk about the two types of foods that we're most concerned about becoming unsafe. The first is TCS food, and TCS stands for foods that require time and temperature control for safety. And so, I kind of think about refrigeration when I think about this. What do we need to refrigerate to control things? So here's the first page of TCS food, and how I encourage you to think about this is these are all animal products. You don't need to break it down and say, well, I see beef, but I don't see pork, and I don't see, all of our meats, so whether it's chicken, beef, lamb, pork, all of our seafood, fish, shellfish, eggs, dairy products, and now again, there are some, dairy products, there are some certain cheeses that don't require refrigeration. There are certain things like that. There may be dried versions of these that don't, but for the most part, these animal product foods are all TCS foods and all need to be kept at controlled temperatures. So this is the first page. So if you just kind of lump it into that animal product category, it'll help you remember these. The second page is a little bit more abstract, and so I'm going to go through those. So we have a baked potato. So again, it's once you cook the potato that we're really seeing that. The one that looks like stir-fry with rice, that's actually standing for heat-treated plant food. And so what that means is, once we're cooking these things, so like rice and pasta, you don't store those in the refrigerator when they're uncooked. But once we cook them, now we have hydrated them and we need to now refrigerate them and keep them at constant refrigeration temperature. Same thing with soy products, so that's the next one. Sprouts. The middle one on the bottom is cut melon, cut tomato, and cut lettuce. And so that cut is important. Our tomatoes, our melons, a lot of times those, when we get them whole, we can store them potentially on the counter, but once we cut into them, now that barrier, that skin that's protected them from pathogens has been exposed, and they're exposed to air, and they're moist foods. And so they are higher risk then at that point. So we just need to ensure that they're kept at proper temperature after that point. And even the same thing with, like getting a nice tomato home from the farmer's market, if I go, and it gets gashed on the way. Well, that's now been exposed air. There's a hole in it, so that needs to be refrigerated. Whereas, other tomatoes don't, a lot of times they'll recommend you don't store them in the refrigerator. So just being aware of, is it exposed to air, is it not? And then the last one is untreated garlic and oil mixtures. So I know that's a lot. But when we have these untreated mixtures with garlic and oil, it can have pathogens that were on the garlic, that were on herbs, and potentially then foster in that environment and lead to some illness. So let me repeat those just because these pictures are great, but it doesn't necessarily say the words for you. So baked potatoes, so cooked potatoes, once we have that on the baked potato category. Heat-treated plant food. Soy products, so this is tofu and then edamame or soybeans here. Our sprouts, cut melon, cut lettuce, and cut tomato, and then untreated garlic and oil mixtures. And so again, I know it's confusing. Make sure you feel good about that. That's one I would go back and look at in your book. And then the other category of food that's most likely to become unsafe is things that are ready to eat. So it's something that I'm not going to do anything else to. I'm not going to prepare it anymore. I'm not going to wash it. I'm not going to cook it. So anything like that, so any cooked food. So again, I see people kind of mix this up with chicken or a meat or something. When it's raw, it's not ready to eat. But once it's cooked, and I could say, all right, I've cooked this chicken, I could use it to make a chicken salad, something like that. It needs to be handled like it's ready to eat at that point as well. Washed fruits and vegetables, deli meats, bakery items, so donuts, things like that, buns, breads. And then the last one that people forget often is sugar, spices, and seasonings, and I'll see people contaminate this a lot. And you have to be careful with this in the kitchen. So if you've worked in a commercial kitchen, sometimes you'll just have a deli container with salt and pepper or something like that. And you have to be very careful how you use that. So if I use that and then I touch my hands into raw meat, well then I need to be careful that I'm not going back into that salt container with hands that are contaminated, because what if I then use that salt to finish a dish that's not being cooked? And so we have to think about that, because I see those spices get contaminated quite a bit. So be careful with those kind of things. But again, these ready-to-eat foods, we should be using tongs or gloves or something like that when we're handling those. So we have 3 populations that have been identified as higher risk for getting a foodborne illness. So preschool-age children haven't quite built up the immune system yet. Elderly individuals, actually a lot of the changes with elderly individuals has to do with changes in their gastrointestinal system. So how they're digesting food and those kind of things can definitely affect their risk of foodborne illness. And then the third group is people with compromised immune systems. So if you primarily serve any of these groups, you may have a little bit different rules that you have to follow. Now, it doesn't mean if you have a restaurant who, some of these children may come in occasionally, which is probably any restaurant, but if it's a place that primarily serves these, a school, retirement home, any of those kind of things, then you definitely have to think about what rules you're following, because your primary population is a higher risk for foodborne illness, and so there may be certain foods not served, etc. So what are some key practices for ensuring food safety? So make sure you're purchasing from approved reputable suppliers, controlling time and temperature, preventing cross-contamination, practicing good personal hygiene, and then cleaning and sanitizing. And so all of these are really important. They will be talked about more throughout the next several chapters that you'll be going on. But just keep that in the back of your mind on these key practices for ensuring food safety. So what is the responsibility of a manager in this? So the FDA recommends that a manager, and this is what the ServSafe exam is, so you guys are taking the ServSafe manager level exam. And so being in that role, whether you are or not, you need to understand what that would look like. So ensure food is not prepared in a private home or where people are living or sleeping. Restrict people other than food handlers from prep, storage, and dishwashing areas. And so that's a big one, know who's in your facility. Ensure outside people, so maintenance and delivery workers who are coming into your kitchen, follow food safety practices. Monitor your staff hand washing. Make sure deliveries come from an approved source, that your fish is being delivered at the correct temperature and it's presented accurately and doesn't look like it was contaminated. Ensure that your TCS foods are cooked and cooled correctly. So things are cooked to the correct temperature, thermometer's been calibrated. Cooling of food is really important, especially large batches of food, making sure it cools fast enough. So all of these you'll see a little bit more about. Also making sure guests are notified of certain things. So hopefully you've seen this on a restaurant menu. If not, look at some. A little asterisk next to a steak or eggs or something that may be served raw or partially cooked. They just need to be notified. Certainly you can serve a rare steak, but you just need to notify the consumer that this is not cooked to the recommended temperature. So as long as you have that recommendation out there, it's fine. Making sure staff are trained on food safety, including all of those. Allergy awareness is a really big thing that they've started to look at more. If you've seen more food allergies kind of come to the forefront of restaurant conversations. Reporting illnesses and symptoms, and that goes for staff illness. That's a big thing the restaurant industry has been looking at as well, how to ensure that our staff isn't working when they're sick. And then making sure our food safety procedures are written down, implemented, etc. So there's lots of responsibilities of a food safety manager. So making sure you are committed to offer training to your staff, make sure food safety expectations are documented, food handling procedures are documented and maintained. Do you have rewards for good food safety? Do you acknowledge staff when they are following good food safety practices and setting a good example? And this is a big one I hear. People come in and serve safe and they'll say, well, that's not what my manager does, or my manager encourages us not to do that because it takes too much time, even though it's really what should be done. And so as a manager, you should be setting that example for, what is the proper way to handle several situations for food safety. So thank you. I look forward to going into more detail on these in the next couple of chapters.